Okay, let's talk about the U.S. national debt. I know, it's one of those topics that can feel just massive, right? You hear these giant numbers, there's a lot of political shouting, and it's easy to just tune it out. But what if we cut through all that noise? What are the actual real-world consequences if this debt just keeps spiraling? Let's get into it.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense way to put it, right? But it really sets the stage perfectly. We're not just talking about numbers on some government ledger. This is a critical situation, one that needs serious attention before it's too late. So the big question is, what would a full-blown crisis actually look like? To really get a handle on where this might all be going, we've got to look back. How did we even get on this path in the first place? Because the road the US is on right now, well, experts pretty much agree it's completely unsustainable. All right, here's the problem in a nutshell. The US government is spending a whole lot more money than it's bringing in from taxes. Simple as that. And to make up the difference, it borrows. Year after year, that borrowing has piled up into a national debt that's now about the same size as our entire economy for a whole year. And look, this wasn't some overnight disaster. It's actually kind of wild to look back at the late 90s when the US was running a budget surplus, taking in more than it spent. But that didn't last long. In the 2000s, you had costly wars and major tax cuts that wiped it out. Then, boom, two huge emergencies hit: the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. And both required massive borrowing to keep the economy afloat. So, what's really crucial to get here is that you can't just point the finger at one single thing. When you break it down, the blame is pretty evenly split. About a third of the problem comes from tax cuts that weren't paid for, another third comes from increases in spending, and the final third comes from borrowing for those big emergencies. And when you add all that up, you get some frankly terrifying predictions. According to models from the Wharton School, if we just keep doing what we're doing, the end game isn't just a little economic slowdown. They're talking about a potential market collapse in the next 20 years. Okay, so if things do start to go south, where are we going to see the first cracks? Well, a lot of experts are looking at one place: the financial markets. That's where confidence is everything. And this analogy really gets to the heart of the whole mystery with the debt. There's a tipping point out there somewhere, a point where the people and countries who lend the US money just lose faith. We know that invisible fence is there, but the scary part is we have no idea exactly where it is until we hit it and get a shock. So who are the ones enforcing this invisible fence? They've got this great name, the bond vigilantes. These aren't guys in masks or anything. They're the big investors. If they start thinking a country's finances are getting reckless, they'll protest by selling that country's bonds. That forces the country to offer higher interest rates to attract new lenders, which can basically force a government to clean up its act. And to give you a little perspective on this, back in the 80s, these so-called vigilantes were getting nervous about a deficit of $200 billion. Today, our annual deficit is about 10 times that size. You can kind of see why the concern is starting to build again. We actually got a little preview of what this looks like just a couple of years ago over in the UK. The government there announced these huge tax cuts with no plan to pay for them, and investors just freaked out. They dumped UK bonds, the currency tanked, and the whole plan had to be reversed. Now, the US is in a much stronger position because the dollar is the world's currency, but that episode was a stark reminder of just how fast the markets can turn on you. But, it's not all about some big dramatic market crash. Even if that never happens, the debt creates this slow, grinding squeeze on our government's budget and eventually on the whole economy. I want you to just let this number sink in for a second. This year alone, the US government is on track to spend nearly $1 trillion just on interest payments. Not on roads, not on schools, not on healthcare, just paying the interest on the money we've already borrowed. And this right here is what really shows you what that squeeze looks like. For the first time ever, the US is now spending more on interest payments than it is on the entire national defense budget. So as that slice of the pie for interest gets bigger and bigger, it automatically means every other priority gets squeezed out. And that's the big reality check for any politician, right? As this quote so perfectly puts it, you can have all these grand plans for what you want to do with the economy, but if the bond market, the Mike Tyson in this analogy, doesn't like your plan, it can punch you in the face by driving up borrowing costs, and your whole agenda gets knocked out flat. So, okay, why should this matter to you? Well, first, it's about fairness. Younger generations are basically inheriting a huge credit card bill for spending that's happening now. Second, a huge debt load can act like an anchor on the economy, slowing down growth for everybody. And maybe most important, it leaves us vulnerable. If another big crisis hits, we'll have way less firepower to fight it.
And the fallout from this isn't just about money or the economy. It actually starts to affect America's place in the world and even our national security.
More than a decade ago, the top military officer in the country, Admiral Michael Mullen, said something that really shocked people. He said the biggest threat to U.S. national security wasn't another country or a terrorist group, it was our own national debt. And his logic was that it would eventually strangle the defense budget. And as we just saw, he was right.
So who actually owns all this debt? Well, a huge chunk of it is held by other countries. Japan and China are at the top of the list. Now, this creates a really complicated situation. It's not like China can just dump all its U.S. debt without hurting itself, but it does give other countries a certain amount of leverage over the U.S.
And you can bet our rivals on the world stage are watching all of this very, very closely. Countries like China and Russia don't just see this as a balance sheet problem. For them, it's a sign of American decline, a vulnerability that they can point to and potentially even try to exploit. Which brings us to the toughest question of all, really. If everyone knows this is a problem, why can't we fix it? The answer, unfortunately, has everything to do with our politics.
Well, it seems like we're just stuck in this loop, this cycle of inaction. Our politics have become so polarized that it's all about scoring points against the other side, not about actually governing. And what's politically popular? Cutting taxes and increasing spending. Both parties love to do it. That makes the really hard choices needed to fix the budget almost impossible to agree on. And so, the debt just keeps on climbing. And this is what's so telling. Remember Admiral Mullen, who said the debt was the biggest threat? Well, he was asked about that recently, and his answer had changed. He said today, our political division is an even bigger threat. Why? Because that division is what paralyzes us and stops us from being able to solve the debt problem, or any other big problem for that matter. And so that leaves us right back where we started. We're walking toward that invisible fence. We know it's out there. The solutions, as hard as they are pretty well understood. The real uncertainty here isn't economic, it's political. So the question is, how close do we have to get to that shock before we finally find the will to change?